Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is American Perspectives. In this video, we're going to talk about the idea of reparations. And I titled this video, Reparations Really? So that'll give you a little bit of clue where we're going with this. But the idea comes up every couple of years when the Democrats want to buy some votes. The last time I remember it coming up was in 2019. And I found it very annoying then, and so much so that it prompted me to write a book. And I wrote this book because people were suggesting reparations. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but it's called A History of World Slavery. And that goes along with the idea of reparations. So we need to understand slavery if we're going to understand reparations. But what is this idea of reparations, just in the simplest terms? Well, it's the idea that white Americans owe money, that is reparations or a fine to be paid, to black Americans because their ancestors were slaves. Okay, that's what it is. It's white people paying a fine to black people because the ancestors of black people were slaves. And there's a black guy, Larry Elder, who is a conservative radio host, who explains the idea this way. And I like the way he worded it, so I'm going to quote from him. He says, reparations is extracting money from people who never owned slaves to give it to people who were never slaves. And I think that's a pretty good explanation. And what he was saying is, it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, does it? So let me ask you, what do you think? Okay, do Americans who never owned slaves owe reparations? Should they be paying damages to people who never were slaves? That's really the question. But before we get any deeper into it, I want to take just a minute and ask you to help me out. If you would, it would be very helpful to our channel if you would subscribe. Hit the little subscribe button down below. Doesn't cost you anything. Nobody will bother you. It just tells YouTube that you like the content here, and that way our video moves up through their algorithm so that more people have access to it. So what about this idea of reparations? Well, I think, as I have listened to people talk about this now for a long time, I think the idea is rooted in ignorance about slavery in general. I mean, other than the fact that one political party is simply trying to buy votes by saying, well, we're going to give you a bunch of money. They're trying to buy votes. But there are people who actually think this idea has merit. And I think the reason they think it has merit is because they don't understand the larger picture of and history of world slavery. And so we're going to take just a moment to talk about that. And really, that's what this book is about, A Brief History of World Slavery. What happened, why it happened, and what we should do about it. You can get this on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Paperback. You can get it on Amazon as an ebook as well. So if when we're done here you want more about this subject, then this might be worth taking a look at. But slavery has been a part of human history as long as there has been human society. When people stopped roaming around as hunter-gatherers in nomadic bands and started living together in societies and expanding what they considered to be their territory, they would encounter difficulties with another tribe who considered the same area their territory, and so they would have conflicts. And as one band of people challenged another band of people for the control of a territory, the tribe that won that conflict would take slaves from the people that they had defeated. And slavery at that time, about 12,000 years ago, had nothing to do with race. It wasn't a racial issue at all. The tribes of a given region would go to war with other tribes in that same region, which meant that they were racially the same. They weren't very different. They were just the other native or the other local tribe. And if they got beaten, then they were going to be slaves of the tribe that won the conflict. And it was purely an economic concern. Okay, it had nothing to do with race. They were all the same race. The economic concern was simply the more slaves that you had to do the hard work, the more wealth you had. You had time to do other things because you could send the slaves out to do the work instead of you having to do it yourself. Slavery was a part of every ancient society. You can't find an ancient society that didn't have slaves. And as one society gained power, as they became stronger and they could defeat another people, then they took slaves from the people that they defeated. And as their power declined, as it eventually does over several hundred years, then they were subsequently defeated by another people and they became slaves. And basically what it amounts to is, if you go back and study the history, and that's what I've done in this book, look at the history and provide data and information, give you historical sources. When you go back and look at that history, what you see is that nearly every group of people in the world were oppressed and enslaved at some point by some other group of people. Okay? Every group of people. It wasn't a white thing versus black thing. That had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was an economic concern, and nearly every group of people in the world were oppressed and enslaved by some other group of people. Now, what does this mean? Okay, well, I'm not black, but some of my ancestors, if you go back far enough, some of my ancestors were slaves. White people were also slaves. A lot of young people don't know that. They think only black people were slaves. That's not true. That's not true. All people at some point were slaves. Some of your ancestors were slaves. Now, if you were black, then you say, well, of course some of my ancestors were slaves. That's the problem. But we're trying to go beyond that and understand that it had nothing to do with black and white. It wasn't just Europeans versus Africans, and the Europeans took slaves, from the African continent. Everybody, whether you were Asian or whether what today we would call Latino, whether you were Northern, Western Europe, or whether you were from the Middle East, whether you were a Christian, whether you were a Muslim, whether you had no religion at all, whether you were a pagan, none of any of those things mattered. Where you were from, what you believed, none of it mattered. If your people got defeated by another people, you were going to be a slave, you see. And slavery in the ancient world was just as bad as slavery would be thousands of years later. Some people argue that the slavery endured by the Africans when the Europeans were trading slaves, that was the worst slavery there ever was. That's not true. It was no different, okay? It was horrible. No question about that. It was horrible. Whether it was 300 years ago or 10,000 years ago, slavery was horrible. Slaves had no rights. Their only value was economic. They were often chained. They did the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous work there was to do. They lived their lives in hopeless desperation. And anytime that is true, it's a horrible existence and a horrible way to live. And that was always the case. Like I said, whether it was 12,000 BC or whether it was in the 16 or 1700s, it was ugly and it was shameful and it should never have happened. But it did, because people aren't perfect. And in the ancient world, up until a couple hundred years ago, all of that time, people believed that slavery was acceptable. All people believed that, even Africans. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Because what many people don't know is that when the Europeans began buying and selling Africans, even though it was still extremely ugly at that point, it wasn't just the Europeans on their own doing this. And so while we're trying to understand how to respond to modern slavery, and what I mean is slavery, in the 16 and 1700s and early 1800s versus slavery 10 or 11 or 12,000 years ago, okay? So while we're trying to understand slavery as it occurred, let's say in Western civilization 200-300 years ago, we need to understand exactly how that slavery occurred. You see, and many people believe that the Europeans went across Africa, raiding villages, capturing Africans to take back to their ship, put them on the ship, and sail to America with them. No, that's not what happened. And people have that idea because of the TV movie that was made back in the 1970s, called Roots. And they showed Europeans showed up, got off the boat, and they went into a village and they chased the people and they captured them and then they took okay, that happened historically. That happened once, maybe twice. Okay, but the Europeans typically didn't do that because it was simply too dangerous and they weren't equipped to do it. Well, so where did they get their slaves? If they didn't go into Africa and go inland and raid the villages and get the slaves, where did they get their slaves? They landed their ships on the coastline of Africa, basically sub-Saharan West Africa, and they went to those powerful coastal tribes there in sub-Saharan West Africa, and they paid them to go inland and do the raiding and the capturing and bring back slaves to sell to the Europeans. Okay? The European slave traders bought from other Africans the slaves that the Europeans, brought to America. Now, I used to live in Nigeria, West Africa, where most of the slaves who ended up in America came from. And if you go just north of where I live, a couple of hours and a little bit to the west, is the country of Cameroon. And right on the border of Cameroon and Nigeria, there's a city called Calabar. And technically, it's in Cameroon. And it's, like I said, it's not far from where I lived. And in Calabar is a slave trade museum. It's one of the most famous things in that whole region. It was a slave market. It's where the slaves who were captured by Africans would be brought to that place, a marketplace, and sold to the Europeans. They would then take them back down to the coast, put them on their ships, and bring them here to America. And the Africans are well aware of this horrible history. It's their museum. They're the ones who set it up, and they have artifacts and other things there. The kind, what do you call them? Handcuffs that they used, basically the chains and the things that they bound them with to bring them back and to sell them to Africa, to the Europeans. They're very much aware of their complicity in this whole thing. Africans were complicit with Europeans in the African slave trade. Now, what has all this got to do with reparations? Well, so when it comes to possible reparations, how much is owed and to whom is it owed and who you're going to collect it from, okay, we need to remember that there were African tribes who went inland and captured other Africans and brought them out and sold them to the Europeans. So do they also owe reparations? Which Africans owe reparation to which other Africans because of their part in the slave trade? Because they were also involved, you see? So of necessity, they would also have to pay reparations, right? So we'd have to go to Africa and collect money from the tribes that raided the other villages and kidnapped Africans to sell to the Europeans. And they would owe part of that reparation. Really? Really? Or is the whole idea of paying reparations something that just doesn't make any sense? It just doesn't make any sense. Because if you go back far enough, my ancestors were slaves too. So who's going to pay me? Who's going to pay me for enslaving my ancestors? I mean, see, the whole thing gets silly at that point. Trying to figure out history that goes back 10,000 or more years. You see, at one time, nearly every group of people on the planet was enslaved by some other group of people. And trying to figure out who owes money to whom for something that happened hundreds or in some cases thousands of years ago is just silly. And I think what it comes down to is the people who advocate reparations are just trying to buy the votes of black people. That's all they're doing. And this isn't going to fix anything. It isn't going to change anything. It isn't going to make anything better. It's just going to cause a great deal more problems and resentment. And it's a silly idea. And you'd be surprised at how many black people even think it's a bad idea. Those are my thoughts today. I hope you found it interesting, maybe helpful. If you did, maybe you click the thumbs up button. And again, maybe subscribe to the channel. That would really help us a lot. But thank you for watching, and I hope you'll watch our videos again. Thanks.